Hi and welcome to Sociology. We're going to look at crime and deviance, and it's looking at part 1. Now, common sense may suggest that some things are simply right and some things are simply wrong. We also tend to think, or at least we hope, that most of us at least most of the time know the difference between right and wrong. But the line between good and bad is constructed by society in a way that is far from simple. This chapter is going to investigate how society encourages both conformity and deviance. This chapter is also introducing the concept of crime and surveys the operation of the criminal justice system. Now consider this. Now you might be familiar with this. A black U.S. SUV rolled through the gates of a federal women's prison in Alderson, West Virginia, threading its way along the sea of news reporters, many of whom leaned towards the vehicle to try and catch a glimpse of the famous woman sitting in the back. Martha Stewart had just been released from jail. Stewart was sent to prison in 2004 after being convicted of lying about alleged improper stock deals. After 5 months behind bars, she was eager to return home. Soon after leaving the prison, the woman who made a fortune explaining how to live life live well, boarded a private jet and whisked her to her 153-acre ranch in Cantanoa of New York. And within 3 days, she reported to her probation officer, who played an electronic monitor on her ankle, and explained that she would be housebound for next 5 months under house arrest. Released then from prison in March of 2005, Martha Stewart resumed her active life, writing books, hosting her TV show, and expanding her Martha brand to cover new products like house paint. Stewart was one of many corporate executives, including several Canadians, who found themselves on the wrong side of the law for engaging in what was called white-collar crime. Let's start looking at this, so let's begin. All societies have norms to reinforce and help teach acceptable behavior. Deviance, any behavior, belief, or condition that violates cultural norms, is what's known as deviance, and it's relative. You could put it on a sliding scale. An act only becomes deviant when it is socially defined as such. Definitions of deviance vary widely from place to place, from time to time, from group to group. What is deviant today may not have been deviant in the past, or may not be deviant in the future. May not be deviant here, but it could be deviant somewhere else. Violations are dealt with through various mechanisms of social control. Systematic practices developed by social groups to encourage conformity. Control can involve socialization or the use of negative sanctions. So when I mention deviance is relative, an act becomes deviant when it is socially defined as such. For example, members of a gang may shun mainstream conformity, yet to be in the group you must adhere to dress codes, other sorts of conformed behavior for that group. Deviance is also ambiguous. Good and bad definitions vary so much that sometimes it's difficult to consider what is deviant and what is not. And deviance varies with degrees. It ranges from mild transgressions of folkways, sexual overtones, to serious infringements of the law, like rape. Now, can be understood to mean not only behavior, but also beliefs. Some forms of deviant behavior are officially defined as crimes. Behaviors that violate criminal law are punishable by fines, jail term, and other sanctions. So we're going to look at this topic in part 2. So what we're going to begin with is looking at the theoretical perspectives. So functionalists use different, we're going to look at 3. They use strain theory, opportunity theory and social bonding theory to argue that socialization into a core values of material success without corresponding legitimate means to achieve that goal account for much of the crime committed by people from lower income backgrounds, especially when a person's ties to society are weakened or broken. So let's look at each of these. First, we'll look at strain theory, goals and means to achieve them. Now, according to strain theory, this is put out by Merton, people feel strain when they are exposed to the cultural goals that they are unable to attain because they do not have access to culturally approved means of achieving those goals. So take in consideration the person who sees commercials like everybody sees, advertising for certain clothing or certain products, but you are a low-income person, or you are a person who has engaged in other illegal activities, you may not have the ability to go into a store and purchase those things. However, you might, because of that strain and not having the culturally approved means of achieving those goals, you might go outside of those culturally normative means to get those things. Subsequent reduction in Canadian taxes and the increased cost of cigarettes in the U.S. dramatically cut the incidence of cigarette smuggling. But the networks and expertise developed by the smugglers remained, turned to new commodities, drugs, alcohol, firearms. Strain theory may also explain upper-class deviance in that there's pressure to increase corporate profits. So if you can't increase your corporate profits through legitimate means, strain theory suggests you might find other means to increase your profits that might not be so legal. The second theory of the functionalist group we'll look at is what's known as opportunity theory, or access to illegitimate opportunities. Now, for deviance to occur, people must have access to illegitimate opportunity structures, circumstances that provide an opportunity for people to acquire through illegitimate activities what they cannot achieve through legitimate activities. So I can't get what I want the way everybody else does, but I can go to a buyer, I can go to a scalper and get those tickets maybe illegally, or I can get that product through some other less legal means because I can't get it through the legal means. And then the third is control theory, or social bonding theory. And it holds that the probability of deviant behavior increases when a person's ties to society are weakened or broken. The major theme here is deviant behavior is minimized when people have strong social bonds that bind them to families, friends, religious organizations, and other institutions. Now, according to Hershey, social bonding consists of attachment to other people, commitment to conventional behavior, involvement in conventional activities, and belief in legitimacy of conventional values and norms. That those four things are the social bonds that keep people following within the social norms of society and not breaching and going into deviant or criminal behavior. Symbolic interactionalists they use differential association and labeling theory to explain how a person's behavior is influenced and reinforced by others. According to interactionalists, deviance is learned in the same way as conformity, through our interactions with others, socialization. So the differential association theory states that individuals have a greater tendency to deviate from societal norms when they frequently associate with persons who favor deviance over conformity. Basically, the more you hang out with people who favor deviance, the more that's what you will start to conform to. People learn the necessary techniques and the motives, drives, and rationalizations and the attitudes of deviant behavior from people from whom they associate. And so the more we associate with people who experience and participate in deviant behavior, the more likely it is that we'll learn what motivates, what are the drives, what do I need to explain to myself to make sense of this, and the attitudes that I need to perform these sort of activities. People are more likely to engage in criminal activity if they have frequent, intense, and long-lasting interactions with people who violate the law. Ties to other deviants, especially important to the world of organized crime, where the willingness of peers to stand up for one another can be critical in maintaining power in the face of violent opposition from competitors. Now, the other theory that they fall in, this is symbolic interactions, is labeling theory. Now, labeling theory suggests that deviants are those people who have been successfully labeled as such by others. The process of labeling is directly related to the power and status of those persons who do the labeling and those who are being labeled. There is a thing called primary deviance. That's the initial act of rule breaking. So the primary deviance is the first act that an individual does in breaking a law. Secondary deviance occurs when a person who has been labeled, you've already gone through primary deviance, you've been labeled, and accepts the new identity and continues the deviant behavior. So the first is your first act. The second is you accept that and will continue to do that deviant behavior. The third group in that labeling is moral entrepreneurs, persons who use their own views of right or wrong to establish rules and labels others as deviants. So moral entrepreneurs often create moral crusades, public and media awareness campaigns that help generate public and political support for their causes. So examples of that: Mothers Against Drunk Driving, the Mothers' Temperance movement of the early 20th century that resulted in prohibition campaigns against abortion, prostitution, and child abuse. 2003 examples of the Roman Catholic, Evangelic, and Muslim and Sikh leaders united against same-sex marriages are examples of that moral entrepreneurship. Stigmatizing labels can last a long time and make it difficult for labeled persons to reintegrate in society. That once one has been labeled, both primary and secondary, oftentimes it's hard to break those labels. Many of the provisions of the Youth Criminal Justice Act were enacted to reduce the impact of labeling of young offenders, because once labeled, it can be very difficult to get out from under that. All right, let's start with conflict theorists. Now, who has the power to define, enforce, and punish crimes and deviance? Conflict theorists suggest that people with economic and political power define as criminal any behavior that threatens their own interests. The powerful then use the law to protect their interests, as well as control those who are without power. So the whole element is about still trying to keep the power away from here, and we'll use our position to say, well, this, and this, and this are deviant, and these are the laws and the sanctions that will come into play. The way laws are made and enforced benefit the capitalist class by ensuring that individuals at the bottom of the social class structure do not infringe on the property or threaten the safety of those at the top. Some of the elements that are included: that the marginalized commit crimes in order to survive, not to become rich. That is to say, people in the lower income aren't committing crimes to become rich, but are committing crimes in order to survive. Frequently, in the struggle for survival, marginalized persons victimize one another and other marginalized people, crimes against other marginalized people. Violent gang activities may be a collective response of young people to seemingly hopeless poverty. Law protects the interests of the affluent and the powerful, and not, as is claimed, the common good of all. According to conflict theorists, the affluent commit crimes because they are greedy and want more of what they have. The poor commit economic crimes in order to survive. Living in poverty may lead to violent crimes and victimization of the poor by the poor. The feminist perspective: Well, the evidence is that women crime rates increase with women's liberation movement. Some theorists suggest that women's deviance in crime is a rational response to oppression and discrimination of women. Patriarchy keeps women tied to family and home. Now remember, patriarchy is male driven, matriarchy is female driven, egalitarian is balanced. So this patriarchy is, from a feminist perspective, is what keeps women tied to being the expressive roles within a family, looking after the family. Another example is the crime of prostitution. Women are more likely to be charged than those men who look to get prostitution. They pay for it, but it's the women who get charged, not so much the men, although that had been changing at one point. Women are exploited by a capitalist and by capitalism and patriarchy, because more women than men have low-paying jobs. Women tend to become involved in prostitution and shoplifting, is the argument. New links between race, class, and gender. Frequently, visible minority women suffer abuse in the home. Deviance in crime is an effect of abuse. Deviance in crime is a form of resisting abuse. Now, when we touch base on the postmodern, now, as have been mentioned in most the semester, the postmodern take a slightly different tact on things. From the work of Michael Foucault, I'm mispronouncing his name, I'm sure, his thesis was on prison control of inmates was not being used through physical punishment but by constant surveillance. So one of the ways that he observed in prisons that control wasn't through punishment but was through constant surveillance. And the term that was described is what's called panopticon. And it's a structure that gives prison officials the possibility to observe criminals at all time using surveillance cameras. Now, the evidence for this panopticon, computers are being used for surveillance over subordinates in companies, toilets that can be monitored for drug use, license plate cameras, facial recognition cameras, closed-circuit cameras in subways, and the use of DNA, all of which may in our own future be things that we'll find being used. License plate cameras are already being used. I was walking through the parking lot at Georgian College campus in Barrie, and the parking attendants drive a vehicle through that have 4 cameras sitting on the 4 corners of the vehicle, scanning license plates to see who used the app to pay and who didn't. And so that's an example of what postmodern would say helps or is the reason that we create this sort of social norms and how to monitor it is through a panopticon surveillance, keeping track of us. All right, this has been a quick review of looking at the first part of deviance and crime. Part 2, we're going to look at types of crime and really dig down a little deeper into the justice system. All right, so good luck, everybody, and we'll see you again next week. Bye now.